You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda.
And this is Prashant Parameswaran from Washington, D.C.
Hey, Prashant, good to be back with you.
Good to be with you.
Terrific. So we're going to be missing you for a few weeks because you'll be traveling. So unfortunately for listeners, this is going to be our last podcast with Prashant for a little bit. But to send Prashant off, and you'll be going to Asia, right?
Yeah, that's right. India and China.
All right. Well, I guess we'll be talking about both those topics, and specifically we'll be talking about India-China relations. We'll do that in the second half of this episode. But first, I've actually been seeing a lot of podcast listeners talking about this, unsurprisingly. There's been a bit of a tiff going on between the National Basketball Association, the NBA, something that I'm pretty sure we've never talked about on the Asia Geopolitics podcast before, and China. And the Chinese government, the Chinese people, there's a bit of a tiff. It originates with a tweet, I guess, last Friday by the general manager of the Houston Rockets. And I'll apologize to listeners. I'm not really a basketball head or anything like that, so I apologize if I get things wrong in terms of the NBA specifically. But broadly, the issue is, and this really relates to something that I think we can zoom out and talk about more generally. The issue is, so the general manager of the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, sent a tweet saying something pretty innocuous if you said it in the United States, right? He said, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And he didn't even say it. I think he tweeted an image simply that someone had created just to show his support for the protesters in Hong Kong fighting for democratic rights. And this sort of kicked up a hornet's nest. And since then, the NBA has basically been sort of taken to the cleaners in China. The Houston Rockets have been denounced by the Chinese consulate in Houston. Morey himself has been denounced by the owner of his team. The NBA has had a very difficult relationship sort of managing this. The Chinese Basketball Association announced that it was suspending all cooperation with the Houston Rockets. So clearly the issue here is that a private American citizen on U.S. soil expresses a view that is then punished by China that ends up exacting costs on his organization. So that's not the first time that's happened, right? This is a familiar story. And actually, in doing some research for this podcast, I put together a list of kind of broader issues that have happened that we haven't actually talked about before. And what's interesting about the NBA, Prashant, and I guess the reason why we're even doing this podcast, is the way in which it seems to be resonating with the average American compared to some of these previous episodes. And it's not just the NBA. I mean, right after this happened, the American video game company Blizzard actually ended up, I guess, punishing a Hong Kong-based player for expressing support for the protesters after that player won a tournament in a popular game called Hearthstone, and Blizzard actually ended up seizing that player's winnings, banning them from competitive play for 12 months, and also banning the game casters that were sort of casting the event that this was part of. So that, again, I think has caused a lot of outrage, at least on the internet right now. If you go to any of the popular sites like Reddit or something, you'll see a lot of kind of people very upset about this, making fun of, Xi Jinping, saying he looks like Winnie the Pooh, because as we all know, gamers are very rational about how they manage their anger about these issues online. But again, so like a quick list of examples. So there was that infamous episode with the hotel chain Marriott where they ended up firing an employee after that employee used the corporate Twitter account to simply like a tweet that was talking about Taiwan or Taiwanese sovereignty. So after the NBA episode, also Nike has removed all Houston Rockets products from their China web store. There's obviously a long history of Apple's strange relationship with China. It's one of the most important markets for the country, so they've sought to preserve their access there. American Airlines, Delta, United, all of the three major U.S. air carriers deleted mentions of Taiwan from their routing maps after China complained about that. What else do we have? We have, so numerous examples of the Taiwan thing, right? Pretty much any major company that lists Taiwan, implying that it might be a country, or listing Republic of China and People's Republic of China, is sort of taken to the cleaners. Basically, they're treated like governments that have to adhere to the one China principle. So all of this raises a very interesting question, which is China is obviously big and powerful and a major market for many of these companies. And many multinationals value access to the Chinese market, but at the same time, having that access gives the Chinese Communist Party incredible leverage given the model of the Chinese economy, to simply shut out companies that don't say the right things or say the wrong things, as it were, about issues that China cares about Chinese core interests. There was a screenshot going around on Twitter, too, about ESPN Sports Center broadcasting a map of China, including not the 9-9, a 9- line in the South China Sea, but the 10- line, a little bit more obscure, but nevertheless, right? So this is kind of the broader topic I wanted to bring up today. So how do we even begin to think about this issue? I mean, Congress has sort of taken a note after this NBA thing. There is a bipartisan letter, and I really mean bipartisan because you have everybody from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to Tom Cotton, probably as far left and as far right you could go between the two houses, chiming in saying that the NBA basically needs to show some spine and stand up to China. But how do you incentivize that when these companies have so much on the line?
Yeah, I mean that's the big question. I mean, as you said, I mean, I think one of the reasons why this controversy has gotten so much traction is the fact that it hits on so many different points of view about, not just the sports conversation, but also U.S.-China relations more generally, right? So as you correctly noted, I mean, we have this sort of broader debate about, we've talked about multiple times on this podcast, intensifying competition between the United States and China. And the big question about that has been not just what this means for governments, but also what does it mean for companies, and what does it mean for individuals who are, speaking their views and, issues of freedom of expression, self-censorship. That's one avenue that I think has gotten a lot of hearing in this controversy. I think the other big one has been, what is the role of politics in sports, right? I think in a lot of this sort of this controversy, you've seen NBA players, and you've seen a number of articles that have surfaced in response, sort of making this argument: should we sort of be talking about this Hong Kong conversation relative to what sports is sort of talking about and basketball games, or is this completely removed from that conversation? And I think there's an ongoing debate about that as well. And one of the interesting things has been, you've had individual NBA players, you've had sporting agents that have had to navigate this conversation. They've been asked, bluntly in press conferences, what do you think about the situation in Hong Kong? And some of the players have elected, I think, very strategically to say, "Oh no, we don't want to talk about that. We want to talk about sports." But I think for some others, it's very clear that there's no real division between business and sports and freedom of expression, right? You have on the one hand the United States and companies and associations like the NBA that are trying to promote sports in a big market like China. And China is clearly making the argument, and I think exacting leverage on the fact that, yeah, we are a big market. And if you want to operate here, there are certain things that you can say about our domestic politics and internal conversations. And there's certain things that you can't say. And if you say those things, we are willing to exact costs so that you realize that, this is something that we don't want to encourage in our politics. So I think it really is a very interesting conversation with respect to those broader conversations. I think the other aspect of that, and I think you had some data from Chicago Council and some of the other sort of polling data that we had that we wanted to talk about, that is related to this broader conversation about, we've had this elite conversation about U.S.-China relations and U.S.-China competition, but how do we tie that into what local people and everyday folks are thinking about U.S.-China relations? And I think we're beginning to see some of that polling data, but that's a bigger question that we need to navigate, right? So as we're seeing the elites and the U.S. president talk about U.S.-China relations, is the elite conversation kind of leading or factoring into the public conversation, or is the public conversation totally removed from where elites are?
Yeah, so thanks for bringing up that Chicago Council data, because I think that's actually really interesting to talk about. So this data was obviously all collected before any of this NBA Blizzard controversy really began. And there's also been other examples recently with the NBA. There were apparently protesters. So after the NBA thing happened, at a few games, protesters carried in signs saying, Google the Uyghurs, and NBA officials actually had those signs removed from them, and that also caused a tiff. And this was, again, games happening on American soil. These were ordinary American fans. I've never been to a basketball game in the United States, but my understanding is that one is free to cheer about anything, really. You can say, you can protest the Uyghurs, you can protest the other team, you can say whatever you want, but apparently, again, this was an example of, speech being censored there. But again, so the Chicago Council data is quite interesting because the point that at least you walk away with, which is that exactly what you said, Prashant, we have this, I guess, shifting elite consensus, I guess. I don't want to say there is a consensus, but broadly shifting consensus towards containment, towards viewing China as more of a threat to U.S. interests than 5 years ago.
Mhm.
As I think you can probably see with this new bipartisan letter, that's probably as bipartisan as anything I've seen from Congress recently. So the Chicago Council found that 2/3 of Americans, 68% in their polling, agreed with the statement that the U.S. should undertake friendly cooperation and engagement with China, while just 3 in 10, 31% roughly, said that the U.S. should actively work to limit the growth of China's power. There's some concerns there about the way the question's framed, but otherwise, broadly speaking, there is a pro-engagement tilt in the public. And what's very interesting about that is that it holds across partisan identification, Republican, Democrat, and Independent. It varies among the parties. Far more, so 74% of Democrats favor taking friendly cooperation with China, whereas just 58% of Republicans, but still a majority in both cases. For Independents, it was around 69%. And for actively working to limit China's power, it's 31% of 31% overall, but 25% of Democrats agreed with that, 29% of Independents, and 40% of Republicans agreed about restraining China. And what's interesting is, to what extent will these controversies begin to pile up and shift American perceptions about China? And this is really the question: is are we at a turning point, or is this NBA controversy being overread, and is it going to be forgotten like some of the other examples that I read out, which created news stories when they happened but didn't really shift the needle? And I think this is an important conversation, especially when we're having a broader discussion about things like economic decoupling and rising economic nationalism, especially in China, where since the beginning of the trade war, Chinese consumers are boycotting American products. Right? If you're buying a smartphone in China, you might want to buy a Huawei phone, even though it doesn't have access to Google Apps anymore, instead of an Android phone from an American manufacturer or an iPhone. In the United States, I think we might start to see people making consumption decisions in a different way, especially after the Blizzard thing. It's been remarkable to see, people kind of. Blizzard creates the very popular game World of Warcraft, unrelated to the Hong Kong controversy, but a lot of people, the boycott Blizzard hashtag has been trending, and people have been sort of tweeting screenshots of themselves deleting their World of Warcraft accounts, which I'm sure is very difficult for many people. So is this something that's going to continue to spiral? And I think my view is that we're starting to see public views, or at least the American public, understand the nature of what it means to live in a world with a powerful, large, authoritarian China that's able to project its preferences on the global stage. It's able to tell private American citizens what they can and cannot say on their Twitter feeds in their time, despite what their day jobs might be. And if there's something Americans don't like, I think it's being told what to say, and especially by a government like China. So this could end up backfiring, especially if we already have policy interests on the Hill, certainly within this White House, but even on the Democratic side, all the Democratic presidential candidates are in a very different place than where the Democratic Party was 5 years ago on China. If the public catches up with where elite sentiment on China is, then I think that sort of bodes very poorly for the broader trajectory of U.S.-China relations, making things like economic decoupling a lot likelier.
No, absolutely. And I think, you hit on another point that's kind of crucial to understand, which is, the domestic environments in both countries. So, you have the United States where, it is the season where you'll have people from various, across the political spectrum who want to take a harder position on China because we're nearing a U.S. presidential election. So you will have this sort of China issue brought up in a more sort of domestic political context in the United States. But it is also interesting, as you noted, I mean, China does have an incentive to sort of send a message to, corporations and organizations like the NBA that you shouldn't intervene in domestic political issues as the Chinese see it. But at the same time, I mean, they also, in China, I mean, one of the interesting things has been, what their response has been relative to the sort of backfiring issue and concern that some folks have pointed out about. So China initially began with sort of a quite a hard line in terms of, some of the NBA events, being canceled. You had sort of, various social media accounts in China sort of engaging in this nationalist rhetoric. But I think there is a sense, I think in China at least, that if they reach too far, they're over politicizing what is generally a sports conversation. I mean, I don't think it's any different in China than it is from the United States. That there is a certain amount or sort of a sort of segment of fans that really just want to watch basketball. And if you over politicize that event either in the United States or in China, you kind of alienate that segment of the population. And the NBA has its own sort of reasons for managing concerns on that, but China also has its own reasons for doing that, right? So you look at the Olympics and how that has mattered for China as opposed to sort of national pride. I mean, China is looking at a scenario where we have the 2022 Winter Olympic Games being held in China. So they also want to navigate this, carefully because, sports is also a market for China equally as sports is a market for the United States. So it really is an interesting conversation for both countries as they seek to navigate those extremes.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Communist Party also doesn't realize how difficult managing the flames of nationalism can be. Really, right? It's not really a it's a blunt tool of policy. It's not something that you're particularly going to be able to use to exact very specific outcomes because it can catch on and spread like wildfire. And I think they need to be careful about that because exactly as you said, I think China has incentives for this stuff to not necessarily spiral out of control in a big way when they have sort of a bigger fish to fry on the policy agenda, right? Mm-hmm. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, what the sum total effect is. There are people who are entirely skeptical and basically point to the fact that nothing will change in terms of China's ability to exact costs on American companies until those very same companies see the benefits of Chinese market access as outweighing all other things, right? So the only way in which American consumers might be able to hold these companies accountable is, by threatening revenue in the United States and elsewhere, and basically making the point that it will serve these companies better to, adhere to the democratic and rule of law based values that we tend to value here in the United States and elsewhere, and preserve market access here versus doing anything and everything possible to placate the Chinese market.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, makes sense.
Anyways, yeah, so that was I think an interesting conversation. I mean, this whole thing I think is really fascinating about how these American companies are reacting to Chinese coercion and compellence on speech. But before we close out the podcast, let's, I guess, go back to a little bit more of a standard agenda item and talk about a summit. So we're recording this on Friday, October 11th, and actually, as we record this, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has just received Chinese President Xi Jinping in South India, where they're going to have a second informal summit. I'm a little confused by the whole idea of an informal summit. Everything from Obama and sunny lands and the shirt sleeves to this Wuhan process. So that began last April when Modi met Xi in China. And this was after the whole Doklam episode in 2017, and the two sides tried to, conduct a reset, broadly speaking, convey in a very frank manner to the other leader what their interests were and how India-China relations might move forward. So yeah, Prashant, we're going to be talking about the summit right as it's happening, but if we're going by the Wuhan precedent, I think we're going to get readouts that are fairly vague, but I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of take stock of the India-China relationship. I think things are in an interesting place, particularly after the August 5th abrogation of Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which changed the internal status of Jammu and Kashmir and bifurcated the state, which China expressed concern about because China has claims in Kashmir, particularly in eastern Kashmir, where the Aksai Chin region is. So that's one issue. But then broadly speaking, there's a much larger issue on economic cooperation between the two sides, particularly, I think, on issues like 5G, which is especially thorny, and the future of a company like Huawei in India. I think those issues are going to come up at this Modi-Xi meeting. On the border issue, I mentioned the Doklam dispute. That's something that I think the two leaders are going to talk about. Whether they'll make progress, I'm a little bit skeptical since, again, this is an informal summit. I don't think the expectation is that they're going to walk away with major deliverables. Mm-hmm. But so what are your expectations for what Modi and Xi might be talking about today?
No, I think you hit on the key points. I think in terms of significance, two things. One is the timing, because as you noted, we do have this sort of Kashmir decision and the fallout being played out between China, India, and also Pakistan. We saw that at the UN General Assembly. We saw that with Modi's visit to the United States. And we've seen that with respect to China and Pakistan and how they've been responding to things as well. So the timing is one aspect of it. I think the other thing is sort of the context that we're seeing as the meeting has taken place. I mean, we've seen sort of scattered protests with respect to Tibet that I think underscores the fact that these two countries, despite the fact that the leaderships on both sides and the countries want to have these summits to say we're kind of managing these issues. These are really difficult issues to manage, and they're not going to be things that can actually be resolved anytime soon. So it's just a process of really longer term management that they have to work out. I think one other thing that's been really interesting is that this whole issue of Kashmir from the Indian point of view, that the Indians are keen to say, this is something that we have to manage with Pakistan. We're not sure why China is internationalizing it. I think the other interesting aspect is that we have Xi Jinping, after this meeting with Modi. I mean, he's headed to Nepal over the weekend, which, just kind of spotlights another component of this China-India competition with respect to the region, right? So the fact that, China is playing out in South Asia, and India is also playing out not just in the Indian Ocean, but also in areas like Southeast Asia and so on and so forth. We are going to see these two big powers play in each other's sort of playgrounds or near broads, whatever you want to say, or sort of call it.
Yeah.
That is, I think, the other aspect of the conversation that seems striking, and I sense that the summit meeting, no matter what they say in the official statements, as you correctly pointed out, it really is this broader conversation that we're talking about that really matters.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain, I guess, maturity to the geopolitical competition between the two countries at this point. India just participated at the foreign ministers level in a Quad meeting, and now, Xi Jinping is meeting Modi and then going to Nepal. And Nepal, since September 2015, they promulgated their new constitution, and since then they've pretty much been drifting away from India and towards China, broadly speaking. So in a way, I mean, the competition is more intense than it used to be, but that might be a good thing in terms of making clear preferences on both sides, right? I think the Indians are speaking up more than they used to on many of these issues in the Indo-Pacific context, especially given that the United States has also changed its China policy there. So that's been interesting, and also India's broader relationship with Japan and Australia in the meantime has also changed. But yeah, I mean, I'm curious to see if if Modi or Xi will really cause a splash at this meeting. Again, I'm pretty skeptical going by the Wuhan precedent. I mean, what Wuhan really did was, I think, created a perception, perhaps a misleading perception, that India-China relations were back on an even keel after the tense days of 2017 with the Doklam dispute. And I'm curious if that's going to happen after this meeting. It might, but broadly speaking, I think there's a lot of kind of unfinished business. But for India, I mean, one of the things right now is we have a lot of indicators that the Indian economy is getting quite sluggish, and I think this is actually a major challenge for the foreign policy of Modi 2.0, which is Modi 1.0 between 2014 and May 2019. Had, broadly speaking, the benefit of a strong economy, low oil prices globally, and that makes doing, if you're an Indian prime minister, that makes a lot of things easier. It makes domestic policy easier, makes foreign policy easier. And we saw Modi take risks, right? We saw things like a demonetization, a stronger Pakistan policy, arguably also as a result of feeling economically emboldened at home. And obviously, after this major electoral mandate, the government seems to be tripling down on sort of nationalist agenda items, including the Kashmir stuff, and giving less attention to the economy. But if the economy does go sideways, I think India's options with regard to China become a lot more limited. So that's I think a particularly important point to be made, is that India's room for maneuver with China might be sort of arrested by its economic options, because at the end of the day, the primary grand strategic objective that every Indian leader has, including Narendra Modi, I think, despite his nationalist preferences, is to keep the Indian economy strong and humming. And if that changes, I think that's going to be a major problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess before we close, one other point that you brought up earlier that I think would be useful to sort of explore. I mean, is what do you think is the role of this employment of this informal summit mechanism as a way for China and India to sort of, the sort of bureaucratic idea is that in these informal mechanisms, you have leaders be able to talk more honestly about issues rather than just sort of the standard statements in a more formal setting. And hopefully they develop a relationship. My own sense is that that hasn't really changed, as you mentioned, the sort of nature of the issues that both sides have to address. But I'm just curious. I mean, this sort of employment of an informal summit mechanism is kind of an interesting, sort of trajectory for the relationship in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an attempt to I think by both sides to see if this new format can lead to new outcomes or new processes, because India and China have a very developed set of formalized and institutionalized diplomatic interactions, right? Like the special representatives process on the border. That has really led nowhere on many of these important issues. And both Modi and Xi are powerful leaders domestically. I think they both see themselves as having sort of a force of will when it comes to foreign affairs. So putting them two in a room and having them interact on a personal level, again, I mean, I think the readouts after these meetings tell us a very little part of what is actually being discussed, just by the nature of these very meetings. So perhaps it is leading to an important source of understanding between the two leaders on a personal level that might lead to some outcomes that might not be possible otherwise. But also, I mean, like I said, I think the perception issue is important. Both India and China, I think, have incentives to minimize the perception that their relationship is more full of friction than it actually is. So having this meeting, they can sit down together and have some nice photographs taken of them chatting casually. It sends a warmer message about the state of India-China relations than the reality might actually suggest. So I think that's also valuable for the two countries.
Yeah, that makes sense.
All right. Well, Prashant, I guess bon voyage for the next couple weeks, and I'll look forward to having you back on when you get back from Asia.
Sounds good.
Great. And for listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes of the Asia Geopolitics podcast. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, don't forget to leave us a review. You can do that on either iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or any other number of podcast providers where you'll find our podcast. And before we close, just a note from our sponsor. So this episode of the Asia Geopolitics podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risk. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. All right, that's all for this episode. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.